Okay, I just wanted to make a quick response video based on the paper drafts that I've seen so far, in hopes that will help you focus on what you need to do for your final draft in the next couple weeks. And for those of you who, for whatever reason, were unable to submit a draft, that you'll be thinking about these things as well. So first, I just want to start with a basic idea of how I graded you. And as you'll see, the drafts are based on an ABC. And I started off with kind of the basic thing, right? Did you follow all the directions? And most of you were able to do that, although some of you struggled with parts of the directions. The main difference then between the A and the B is going to be whether you simply provide a descriptive answer, which I'd call like the book report approach, and I'll talk about that a little bit more, or if you had a substantive answer, right? Did you have something to contribute and add to this conversation? And remember, in order for me to grade you based on the learning outcomes that you're supposed to be learning through the Justice Academy, regardless of whether you're a criminal justice student or if you're a liberal arts student, you have to show me that you're thinking, that you have something to contribute, not simply that you're able to copy and paste things from a website. Now, the final paper will be graded very similarly, but now, it's going to be, did you actually respond to what I told you? For those of you who didn't get your draft in, you're obviously not going to be able to do this. So you're going to have to really think about those learning outcomes clearly and show me that you understand them. Those of you who will continue to struggle, I can only speculate as to why that will be, but certainly reach out to me if any of this is unclear or if you need some further feedback. I won't be able to give the kind of feedback that you would have been able to get if you submitted your draft on time or early. And then obviously, like the C level is that you're just struggling with the assignment or college work in general. And a couple of you, I can assume that because it's a draft, maybe you didn't put as much effort into it as you would the final draft. That's certainly not shocking. And so, I think you could go from a C to an A. I don't think that's impossible, but you want to try to just kind of stay on track on your own from this point. And then, I didn't give anybody a warning or a no credit on this, and I'm hoping I won't have to do that on the final as well, on the final paper as well. So let me just go over the most common problems first. A lot of you were descriptive instead of analytical. In a class that this level, 66, 67, and as you kind of continue on, you're no longer doing descriptions. Descriptions are something you might do in English 12, depending on your teacher, maybe in Intro to Criminal Justice, POL 63, sometimes in POL 51. And what they're looking for you to do is describe like what you found, right? So I call that a curiosity quest. So you go onto the internet, you conduct some research, and then you describe what you found. It reminds me of a speech class as well. In these kind of classes that you're in now, more advanced classes, you now need to do analysis. So you need to do something, that is called synthesis. So after your research, you need to reduce that to a page or less, right? What is the significance of the things you found? Don't tell me what you found. I could find those things too. What I need is, why does it matter to you? What is it that you think is important about those findings? And how does it answer the question? And then more importantly, I think for those of you who care about grades, right, how does that address the learning outcomes of the course? So I'm just going to say this as clearly as possible. It's not a high school book report, and that's mostly what I was reading with the early drafts. They just read like book reports. So you need some theory of criminal activity here, deviance, right? That's the whole point of this learning outcome, is that you have something to say about the social response to crime, or if you want to think about it a different way, if you want to be more positive, how a community constitutes its norms and rules. I only had one of those assignments that came in, but that student did a good job of really thinking about what would it need to take for a community to constitute its own rules. So rule following and deviance, right, are two sides of a coin, and it's going to be different depending on what community. So a lot of you are making these big, huge, broad generalizations. Again, I don't know, many of you didn't provide source citations, so I don't know where you got this information. But you need to apply it a little bit more tightly. So you might focus on just New York City instead of speaking so broadly. And then think about who gets to make the rules and who gets to decide what's deviant or criminal behavior. You need some informed opinion with legal reasoning, right? These are both legal classes that I teach. So you need to think about the law. And there's three ways of thinking about the law. And I made another video about that. But you need to think about the institutions of law. That's about the rules, norm following, things like that. You need to think about the instrumentalities of law. Many of you skipped over that part. So you should be thinking about lawsuits, when it comes to homelessness. You should be thinking about rights. You can think about protest, advocacy. There's different ways of using legal principles as a form of law, so you need to be thinking about that. Many of you are talking about legislation as if it's, ideal or unique. You have to try to investigate further who were the people who lobbied and advocated for that legislation. It's not going to be homeless people, and it's probably not going to be homeless advocates. So you need to move deeper in your research instead of just that kind of descriptive thing. And then some of you didn't follow the directions, which is always frustrating for me. Some basic things, like I asked for a Word document. Some of you said PDFs. I accepted it this time. I converted the documents. But I'm not going to do that on the final. On the final paper, if you send a PDF, I'm just not going to open it, and I'm just going to give you an F. So make sure that you send me a Word document. It's a pretty simple thing to ask for, and please just do that. The other thing is you have to address the questions that are asked. Many of you answered questions that weren't asked, and you didn't answer all of the questions that were asked in the instructions. So I guess I'll go over that in a second. But let's start with the big picture, right? You have to remember laws are constituted, right? They don't come out of nowhere. They don't fall out of the sky. They're not handed down from on high. They're made by social groups. And obviously more powerful social groups who have access to the political system are going to pass those laws, legislation. They're going to push for codes. They're going to push for enforcement that benefits their interests. But there are other groups that participate, or they advocate, or they protest. And so there's always kind of this give and take. So you have to think of this as a process, right? It's not one way. It's not a one-way street. It's not even really a two-way street, right? It's an intersection. So you're trying to capture like all these different things that are going on to see how law is formed by social groups. That was really missing in all the drafts. So try to keep that big picture. And look over to the right? This class is about revolutions. These are about these big questions about, how people are going to form government, whether they're going to give certain rights away, how they're going to think about security, what things they're going to think about when it comes to law and deviance. So you really need to think about these things deeply. And then really you got to get at these learning outcomes. I know it's not the easiest thing in the world, and many of you haven't practiced at it, but you got to try as hard as you can to meet the learning outcomes. So think about the promises and organizational structure of the Constitution. We're not talking about the amendments. We're not talking about what you think your rights are. You need to look at the actual structure of the Constitution. Who does it give explicit power to? Who are the people who get to become legislators? Who are the people who get to become part of the Supreme Court? What are their jobs? What are they supposed to do? You got to think deeply about that. Again, you're not describing those things. You're not copying and pasting them from the Constitution. You're going to read them. You're going to think about it. What does this say about the structure of power? What does this say about who is ideal in that system? And is that based in reality, or is that more of a, that wouldn't it be nice if we were all equal? And then think about, people deviate from the Constitution all the time. Every day. So you have to think about, what does that mean? Does that mean that they just don't care about the Constitution? Are they confused about it? Are they more interested in their own selfish interest? When they say that they're trying to bring people together, what does that look like? These are questions that you have to be raising and thinking about, and not coming up with very overly generalized, simple answers. This is a complicated process. It's not simple. And then you need to analyze the problem of homelessness as social deviance, right? So a lot of you did this well. I think you very clearly understand now that homelessness is not a thing. But the concept, right, the legal concept of homelessness is linked to deviance, right? And you saw how certain groups have been excluded. And let's be blunt and clear, the most constantly excluded group in the United States were enslaved people, and now that legacy continues on as dark-skinned folks. And so vagrancy, homelessness, these topics mostly affect Black and brown people. One person very correctly also said it also affects youth, which is very tragic. But you have to think about this not just in the negative sense, and this is very sad, of course it is, but you need to think about the productive side of this, right? There's benefits to certain people for excluding these groups of people. There were benefits to people in the South for excluding enslaved Africans from the political system, and that continues today. So don't just look at the negative side of it. Clearly state that, that's obvious, right? But then you have to see, how does this benefit these other social groups? And that will help you to understand why they maintain that system, right? they might feel terrible that they're treating people inhumanely and unjustly. They might feel like, wouldn't it be nice if we could help different people? But they're getting all these benefits from not helping people, and that's part of the law as constituted. You need to understand that a little bit clearer. And then also make sure that you're always thinking about the 3 levels of law, the 3 dimensions of law, or what I call the 3 eyes of law, right? The instrumentality, how the law is used as a tool, as in its forms. Could be legislation, could be protest, could be lawsuits, right? Could be policy proposals. But also there's the ideological point of view, which is the ideas that people have about law. And there's a big, huge myths like the myth of individualism and meritocracy, or that we have rights. And then there's like small level myths, right? Like that some people are equal, but others aren't, right? That inclusion is something that's easy. And you need to really think about these stories and how they interrelate with the ability to use the instruments of law. And then finally, the institutions of law, like courts, corrections, police, right? These are norms and rules that are mostly about the people who work in those industries, that work in those areas and who wear those costumes. Right? How does that affect these other groups who have been excluded from the political process? They don't really know the rules. They don't know what they're supposed to do. So what does this say about a constitutional structure? And then finally, you need to make clear connections to the coursework, right? So none of you really made any connections at all to the previous coursework. So it's as if you were taking 2 separate classes. Again, a lot of this goes to because you're not analyzing. So you need to sit down and think and not copy and paste. I want solid writing about what you think. Right? I don't need to know what other people think. I've done that research. I need to know what you think. Should homelessness be a crime? If not, why not? If you think no, then how come it is, right? Why is it treated like that? A couple of you stumbled on the idea of labeling theory that comes from the Chicago School of Social Disorganization. Professor Barnaby teaches about that, and that's a great way to analyze this problem. There are other ways of thinking about the problem. Again, I would have hoped that you got that information in Intro to Criminal Justice. But, some brief research, you could just see what are the theories of the causes of crime. You could look at Durkheim, you could look at Foucault, you could look at some of the more modern thinkers like Michelle Alexander, Paul Butler. But, the idea here is stick with the theory, and explain it. How does it explain this problem? There's also Marxist kind of critique you could use. A couple of you kind of talked about that without mentioning Marx, which is fine. You don't have to mention the author, but just stick with the theory. What's the theory that you're coming up with? Is it primarily based in race? Is it primarily based in supremacy? Is it primarily based in economics? But you want to make those connections. Come back to the constitutions you reviewed, the cases you read, the videos you watched, right? Show me that you're engaged in the process, and then I can give you an A. So the good, right? There's not just bad, right? There's good things that happened out of this draft. Many of you are thinking through these and taking good notes. That's what I saw. So most of the drafts were notes, and that's fine. That's a good place to start. That's actually pretty similar to how I start a draft when I'm writing something. So think, good that you got a good way to go, but now you need to step it up. So analyze what you wrote. Read back through and see, okay, you got to shorten this, got to synthesize it, got to pull out the big ideas. And be clear about what you think the arguments are. Don't make other people's arguments. Make your own argument. Don't say things like research shows. I don't know what that means, right? Research doesn't show anything. Data doesn't talk. People put these things together. These are also constituted. Laws are constituted. Research is constituted. Ideas are constituted. So you need to show me that you understand that. You need to think, what does this mean for the CRJ system? Right? It's not just corrections, it's a whole system. So that means it's going to have its own ideology, right? Police officers are going to have a very different story that they tell about the universe and how people react with each other than judges, right? Judges see a different set of people. Lawyers are going to see, different depending on what they do, right? An entertainment lawyer is going to have a different idea about what's fair and what's right and wrong than a criminal defense lawyer or an intellectual property lawyer. And then think about the political, right? And political here is a struggle for power. If one group is dominating another, then that means the other group is resisting. So talk about how that resistance looks, right? It's legal to resist. It's the ancient Magna Carta English tradition of resisting the abusive use of power. So resistance, protest is not illegal. I know this is hard for many of you to accept, but even breaking windows in your protest is not illegal. The American revolutionaries destroyed a ton of property in their protest and resistance against the British monarchy. The French, the Haitians, right? This is a common thing. So there's a legal resistance. There's a legal property destruction. I know it's hard to think about, but you want to think about both sides of it. It's not just social control. So you can tend towards social control, believe that that's important, but analyze how that's political and which group is kind of winning out. And then I just want to end with this idea about the final draft. If you're writing about homelessness, which most of you are, this is what you really have to do now to make sure that you get an A. Think about human rights. Should homeless people have access to the courts? Should they be able to advocate? Should they be able to sue? Should they be able to get fair housing, mental health services, healthcare, childcare, right? These are guaranteed human rights. So how is this going to happen though? It's not one, yes, they should, right? Somebody's going to say that. But then how? Right? Is this going to be a government agency? Is this going to be something like victim services that's going to go into the criminal justice system? How is this going to be constituted? Is there anything in the Declaration of Independence or preamble to the Constitution, or maybe the 14th Amendment, right? Is there some research you can do in the Constitution that links these rights to these groups? And then you need to make that argument. The other idea here that you need to think about is that you've been asked, or we've been asked, right, as part of the Justice Academy, to think about this learning outcome of the social response to crime. Now, most of you did a good job of this. There's not one social response. There's dozens, right? But now you want to explain the differences. Why do some people see homelessness as a crime while others see it as a political and economic reality? Explain those differences and explain how that contributes to the social response of crime. I'm going to leave it there and let you kind of think these through, but try to make these clear connections. For those of you who are going to write about the community constitution, what I'm really looking for here is that you're able to show me that the processes, right, the way people vote, how they're going to be included, how they're going to be excluded, and how you're going to define the community within that set of area, right? Like, is that going to be a number? Is it going to be based in religion? Is it going to be based in ethnicity? How are you going to determine who gets to make these decisions? And how are you going to know that you made a decision? And then, as I suggested to one student, think about some emergency, right? Like a snowstorm, a flood, invasion, something, where these powers are really going to be tested. And then analyze, how is that really constituting to the idea of a social response in general? And deviance in this sense would not be homelessness. It would be just whatever's against the norms of that small group. And there's lots of good examples, but I would kind of, two things I'd get you to think about is go ahead and Google search or YouTube, right? This thing called the lottery. The other one would be the scarlet letter. These are kind of colonial responses of social response, right, to deviance. And try to think about how we do that today on a micro scale. Don't think about it the whole country. Don't even think about all of New York City. Think about it in like neighborhoods, right? Why is Bushwick treated differently than Brownsville? Why is the Upper West Side treated differently than parts of Queens, right? Why is the Bronx treated differently than Staten Island, right? Try to make these connections about what the community is and how they define their norms. Another great example would be just consider like the idea, and right now you don't want to do this, but I've done this before, is take the train through as many boroughs as you can and watch how the rules change, right? The makeup of the community changes, how people interact with each other changes. Think about that. How do you enforce rules and have a social response to deviance when it's unclear what deviance is? So we're really trying to get away from law as an ideal and really getting into the practical reality. So those are some suggestions, again, if you want to get an A, and just some observations I made. These are pretty consistent from semester to semester. And again, I think you're off to a good start. And now you just want to kind of push down the gas.